Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Her Faith Inspires podcast, where we take cultural issues and we tackle them with biblical truth. And I have Annie Crawford back on the show. She was on not too long ago with Josh. We were talking about, uh, AI and technology, and more specifically, that was called "Are We All Cyborgs Yet?" And Annie, I could just tell when I was talking to her, she communicates when she communicates, I click with her. And I thought, you know what, my audience is going to resonate with her too. She talks on so many other topics, not just technology. And so we, talked about having her back on. And so she is going to share some information with us, some wisdom about the meaning of life and finding meaning, and because we have a crisis of meaning within our culture. And as we get into talking about this today, I think it's going to resonate, and I think it's going to be helpful for you. So, Annie, I just want to say welcome back, and then remind us of who you are, Annie, and what you do.
Yeah, thanks, Shonda. I'm really excited to be talking with you again. So I am a classical educator and cultural apologist, which really both of those spheres, teaching high school students, great text, teaching apologetics classes. I write and speak on that topic. Both of those kind of streams of my work are centered around recovering a sacramental view of the world, a sacramental worldview, which is really just a Christian worldview, and is something I'm sure is exactly what we're going to talk about today. What is a sacramental worldview, and how does that relate to this meaning crisis that we're seeing around us? So I'm excited about our topic because it is at the heart of all the different things I talk about, and really my passion for what I'm doing. So thanks for having me on to talk about it.
Yeah, I'm excited too because I talk a lot about worldview. I think we all talk about worldview because you have to. I mean, it drives our beliefs and our decision making and how we live. And the big questions of life, every worldview answers those. And one of them is, what is my purpose? What am I here for? And that is so crucial to how we live, and it's attached to our identity and all of those things. So I'm excited to talk about it. We're more specifically, I guess we're talking about recovering meaning in our current culture. So when you're talking about this, what do you mean when you're saying we need to recover meaning in our culture? And why do you say it's a meaning crisis?
Yeah, great place to start. So, and you do hear more and more people using this term, we're in a meaning crisis. And I thought it'd be helpful to actually define meaning, to start with defining what do we mean by meaning? Because when you think about that question, you actually realize, oh, meaning's kind of hard to define and get a grasp on. And we know it has to do with, synonyms are like our significance, the value of something. Um, you know, so I was thinking, let's like of an example, kind of think of something that's meaningful to us in terms of trying to pin down what do we mean by meaning. So I was looking around, I'm in my husband's workshop. What's something in here that's meaningful? And I found, I don't know if you see behind me, there's a little picture of Yoda
Mhm.
that I found on his wall. And so I was thinking about, okay, what is it that makes this picture of Yoda meaningful? It's not made of gold or diamonds, its value isn't coming from, let's see, the material it's made of, but it's meaningful to my husband, because his mom made it. It's one of those pictures where you place little crystals one by one. And
Mhm.
then, because it's a picture of Yoda and he grew up watching Star Wars. And so, this picture that's in his shop is meaningful because of the connection it has to his mother, to the movies he grew up watching. And so, really, meaning comes from connection to things. Um, and I don't know if maybe your audience or you are familiar with the cosmological argument or Aquinas's argument for the existence of God that he makes from motion. And then maybe it's basically a kind of first cause argument, right? That we look around in the world and we see things in motion. But if you kind of were to rewind the tape of the world, you'd have to get to some kind of unmoved mover, some kind of first cause of all those motions. And often people think about, a line of dominoes as an analogy. Well, this domino knocked that domino, going all the way back. But what knocked down the first domino? Because it's not in the nature of dominoes to move themselves. And so logically, you need that kind of unmoved mover. So I find this helpful as an analogy for meaning, right? So why is this picture meaningful? Well, my husband's mom made it. Well, why is she meaningful? Because she gave him life, right? Well, why is life meaningful? Well, because God made it, because God made us in his image, because God gives our life value. So, kind of pull that together. Things have meaning through a relationship to something else that gives them significance. But our world is made by a kind of chain of relationships that ultimately needs to be grounded in God. God as the source of meaning, the one giving life meaning, mother's meaning, stories meaning. And so why we're in a meaning crisis, right, is that in the modern world, by having rejected God, cut out God from our understanding of the world, we have lost the very ground of meaning. And I think what's happened is that the modern world, we've been able to pretend that we had meaning for a while, right? But like a vase of cut flowers, you cut them off from the ground of meaning, and you still have them in the vase of water, and they'll stay fluffy for a while. But it's inevitable, having been cut off from the ground of meaning, right, that those flowers are going to end up falling apart. And that's kind of the stage I think our culture is at. We've cut ourselves off from the ground of meaning, which is God, and it's sort of sustained for a while, but now we see it all really falling apart and realizing, oh no, we're in a meaning crisis. And I think a few indicators of that are, Matt Walsh's famous question now, what is a woman? Like, we don't know what it means to be a woman. Well, that's pretty basic level of meaning, right? You also see it in, the abortion debates, to call a human, a baby human, just a lump of cells. Like, we don't know what a baby is anymore. And so I think those are a few examples of where the flowers are starting to fall apart, meaning is collapsing. We need to find some kind of new ground for that series of relationships that ground the meaning of things for us.
Ooh, that's really good. So the reason we have a meaning crisis is because we've detached our relationship with God. We've detached from that. And the result is now we can't define what, like, things as simple as what a woman is, or we can't even define human value because we won't define that baby is a human being valued or even created in the image of God. So meaning and value are very much related, but at the same, that's so good, because I don't think that I've thought of it as a meaning crisis. Like, I could say, okay, when the last Supreme Court justice, it wasn't Sonia Sotomayor, it was I forget the one, but she was even asked, what is a woman? I thought, she's a judge, like she's sitting in the highest court of the land, and she will not answer this question. And she knows. And that would be, I guess, another question. I don't know if this is even going to make sense, Annie, or if we even know the depth, I guess, of this crisis. So you may not have a specific answer, but what does it say when when you're looking at somebody and they're just trying to justify, maybe the transgender ideology, maybe they're trying to justify that, maybe they're trying to justify abortion, so they won't attach meaning, they won't define something to give it meaning. What does that say? Because I don't think it's because of ignorance. Do you?
Yeah, I mean, that's a complicated
I know.
question, right? And ultimately, probably for each person, the motives are different. I do think that we have right now kind of the ideologues who are driving certain narratives and perspectives for perhaps their own gain and power, and then you have a lot of people who are just confused. who are as our education system has kind of crumbled, they're not good at thinking clearly, and so they're prey to propaganda, and they're children of divorce, and so I think most people are lost, and I think of Christ who says he looked at the people and he I don't know if he said he wept for them, but he grieved for them, he felt for them because they
Mhm.
were without a shepherd,
Yeah,
right? And so in terms of what's, you know, um, you know, why is someone seeing the world the way they are? I think that will really depend on the person.
yeah, yeah,
Um, and however, I think it's very valid and important to trace where the ideas come from,
sure,
right? And
sure.
then that tracing where the ideas come from helps us clarify, um, you know, see better whether they're true, whether they're not true, and sort through all of that. Whereas
Okay.
why people hold those beliefs, yeah, that's pretty personal.
So I think that, that makes sense. I think we're looking at postmodernism. I mean, that's where we are currently. We're in the postmodern culture where it wouldn't be where it's almost permissible not to define something objectively, like to get down and say a woman is a female adult with reproductive, whatever we want to get into that definition. But so it's postmodernism, but why has postmodernism created this need to recover meaning? And it's probably because something like that, but I'm sure you can articulate it better. And what are the results of postmodernism in our culture? Like what,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm
How does
seeing,
the meaning
yeah,
crisis relate to postmodernism? Yeah, that's a great question. I think your intuition is spot on here. And I find it helpful to back up a little bit and realize that postmodernism begins with modernism. Um, and that the modernism, all these terms get, a little bit confusing and hard to define and used in different ways. But in general, modernism, the modern era is the attempt to understand everything through reason alone, and the best methods for using reason to understand something are the methods of science, right? And so modernism is this attempt to apply the rational methods of science to understand everything, not just physics, but also people and societies and religion. And what happens is when you use the tools of science, of rationalism and science to look at everything, you start to see everything as that which science studies, right? To a hammer, all the world is a nail, right? And so when you see science as the only valid way of knowing everything, then you actually reduce the whole world to merely physical stuff. And so that's kind of what we've hypnotized ourselves into by applying science more and more and more and more. We've convinced ourselves that things are merely the kind of stuff that science studies. And so
mhm,
that's where you get materialism, right? This reductive materialist worldview. And that leads to postmodernism. So I find it really helpful to realize that modernism and postmodernism are kind of two sides of the same coin. Well, if everything that modernist rationalism tells us, if everything's just stuff, only molecules in motion, then there is no meaning to the things, right? The
yeah,
material world is flat. When you study physics, you don't treat one molecule as more valuable than another molecule. You're just looking for the mechanisms by which they interact with one another. And so when we take on this kind of scientific, materialist view, we see the whole world as just stuff.
mhm.
And there's no reason to make one electron or one proton more significant or valuable than the other. We get this kind of flattened world. Well, meaning and comes from a hierarchy. Like meaning and value come from saying, a child is more valuable than a salamander. There's more significance, there's more value. So meaning and value depend upon a hierarchy,
Mhm.
and materialism flattens the whole world, right? Okay, so what postmoderns come along and say is, okay, well, if we're gonna if everything's just material stuff and there is no hierarchy of value, um, then your truth, your value can't be more significant than mine. And so when I say that this picture of Yoda is valuable, that's just me attempting to impose meaning or significance on the world. And this is where the postmoderns start to say it's all about power plays, right? That when I say something's valuable, that's me trying to exert power on the world, my own power by creating, by arguing for what's valuable or important to me, right?
Hmm.
Okay,
Hmm.
so the postmodernists say if everything's material, modernism, all right, fine, then there is no such thing as intrinsic value or meaning or purpose, and everything's just a power play as we make up meaning or narratives for ourselves. Um, so this is what the existentialists said in like the mid 20th century, right? Think Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre. What they tried to say is, okay, nothing has intrinsic meaning. We get to make up that meaning for ourselves. And this will be a kind of like liberation and personal freedom. And we can create our own meaning. And won't this be wonderful? You do you, and you can discern your truth. And so I think we've kind of tried existentialism for a while in a culture, this postmodern existentialism. But again, we're reaching this point where the cut flower is falling apart. The illusion is fading. This existentialism, this we'll make up our own meaning. Again, think about the abortion issue. Well, it's a baby if I want it to be a baby, but
Yeah.
if I don't want it to be a baby, it's just a clump of cells.
Right.
But what's happening is, one, the human heart craves meaning. Like, we hunger because we were made for food. We thirst because we were made for water. Well, we search for meaning because we're made for meaning. And just like the body can't give up on looking for food, the soul can't give up on looking for meaning. We have this feeling that we need to be significant in relation to something higher than ourselves, right?
Hmm.
Making up our own meaning is exhausting. It's constant effort, right? And so I think we're becoming exhausted. I think the people who try the hardest to make up meaning for themselves are becoming narcissistic. I think it's why we see a rise of narcissism. All these people obsessed with kind of building their own life just the way they want it, right? I think it's degrading our relationships because, I'm enjoying talking with you, Shonda, because of the things we share, because
Hmm.
of the love of God that we share, the care for other people that we want to help. Those shared value, that shared meaning is what allows us to have relationship. It's creating a lot of conflict. Well, this man says he's a woman, but I don't agree with that value. I don't want to share a bathroom with him, right? So making up our own meaning creates all kinds of conflict because we don't agree on the meaning and the value of things. And then I think, lastly, there's just a lot of feeling of despair and apathy. Like,
Hmm.
okay, if there's no shared meaning, there's no hierarchy of meaning, like why bother?
Yeah.
Why bother getting up? Why bother, the hard work that life is? And so kind of for all those reasons, that's why I think we're seeing this crisis point where postmodernism is kind of run out. And I think we're turning the corner to something else where people are saying enough is enough. I need a transcendent source of meaning. I need something higher to give my life significance. And so as we're turning the corner, and I don't know if you see this, but I see a rise in spirituality, you
Hmm.
know, and a rise in occultism, kind of a rise in non-Western religions, people interested in Islam, converting to Islam,
Yeah.
a rise in Eastern Orthodoxy. I think this can help, us understand the rise of nationalism,
Hmm.
right? That
Hmm.
is looking to the nation as a kind of source of identity and meaning can function as a religious substitute, right? And then also the sudden rise of all this social justice woke ideology,
Hmm.
because kind of being an activist, fighting against power, that also can have a sense of a religion, of something that's giving my life a higher source of meaning and identity. And so, a lot of what I'm trying to do is help the church do better to respond to the crisis, to say, okay, postmodernism is dying. People are hungry for meaning again. Christians, let's do a better job communicating to the world the riches of meaning that the Christian story has to offer.
Yeah, I think that's something that I've heard. I was listening to John, oh my gosh, he is the lead singer of Skillet. Why can't I think of his last name right now? You know what I'm talking about?
I don't even know who
Okay.
Skill is, if that's embarrassing to say.
No, he's just it's like a Christian rock band, but he's been around for a long time. He does, oh, John Cooper, he does the Cooper Stuff podcast. Anyways, he was even saying today, like, I see a shift, I see something different happening within culture. People are wanting, uh, and I would say he didn't say the word meaning, but I would say that it's an equivalent to that. And we can get hopeful as Christians and think, oh, great, they're going to turn to Christianity. It doesn't mean that they'll turn to Christianity. They're looking for who's going to provide that meaning, and they're going to attach themselves to that. And so we have to be ready to give a defense for our faith, like Peter says in 1 Peter 3:15. We have to be ready to give an answer. We have to be ready to say, hey, Christianity, a biblical worldview can best answer these questions for you. And I was going to ask you, and you answered the question as well, that does this have an effect on the mental health crisis that we're also seeing? And you pretty much said it does. And we've seen that just skyrocket, especially starting in 2020, but I don't know that it's necessarily gotten any better since then. And I think a lot of it has to do with, yeah, 2020, people were, there was lockdowns and people got depressed and weren't sure what was happening. But I would say also that it's an extension of just what the culture is going through with this meaning crisis. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, yeah. I think it was there. We were entering into a meaning crisis, and what 2020 did was sort of exacerbate the crisis, right? Cut people off. When you're um, isolate people a little bit more, cut people off a little bit more, and kind of catalyze problems that were already there.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's good.
And have you heard of Viktor Frankl?
I haven't. Mm-mm.
Oh, I am real embarrassed right now that I cannot remember the name of his book, his famous book, but he was a Holocaust survivor who wrote about, gosh, I can't remember if he was able to write while he was in the concentration camps, but when after he was released, I think it's Man's Search for Meaning. Oh, goodness, I'm gonna feel
I'll
bad
look it up.
for that.
Viktor
Yeah,
Frankl, you said?
Viktor Frankl. Yeah, and his
Okay.
his thesis was you can survive anything. Like the people who could survive the concentration camps. I mean, the mass suffering and starvation and horrors that they experienced in the concentration camp. Some people were able to survive it with their soul intact. And the common denominator he saw was they were people with transcendent meaning.
Mm.
Peoples whose souls and hearts were anchored to something higher, something eternal, something enduring. And they were able to psychologically handle that suffering. And so I think that's where, most of our secular culture, people aren't anchored in something of eternal significance. And so then when the crisis or the suffering of the pandemic comes, they don't handle it well, right? It sort of opens up the latent crisis that was percolating beneath the surface for a while.
Was it Man's Search for Meaning?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's what came up. Okay, so I'm going to read this question to you because I wrote it because we had finished Ecclesiastes, the entire book of Ecclesiastes at my church. And I love it. Some people think it's depressing, but I don't think it's depressing. I see such hope in it. And Solomon had to learn a really big lesson. And so it was Solomon who we think wrote the book, who said, vanity, vanity, all is vanity. And I think he said that a lot throughout the book, right? Which you can also replace that word vanity with meaninglessness, like
Yes.
meaningless, meaningless, it's all meaningless. So
Yeah.
he made the case that he basically tried everything under the sun, everything that he could see, touch, taste, smell, and nothing brought him that satisfaction, that meaning. And so, I mean, that was how many years ago? Thousands of years ago. And I see this human need to find meaning, like that echoes from those words of Solomon, who during that time had everything that you could imagine. I mean, he had all the riches, he had all the wisdom. And so now we have this society today that's trying to find meaning and purpose in things like the victim mentality and gender identity. And so I'm wondering, how is this need for meaning and purpose innate to the way that God has created us?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I also love Ecclesiastes, and I think the key to understanding it is exactly what you said, that phrase under the sun, which he repeats
Hmm.
so often, under the sun, under the sun. And so that's a little bit of, I think, similar to what I was talking about, the horizontal relationships versus the vertical. And that in terms of under the sun, in terms of just this material world alone, things don't ultimately have meaning. And I can, kind of seek meaning in a horizontal relationship to money or to comfort, or but what makes money, what makes this life meaningful? We need that horizontal relationship to something, I'm sorry, vertical relationship to something above the sun, something
Hmm.
transcendent, something internal, eternal, that ground of meaning or higher source of meaning that can then infuse this world with significance. And so, yeah, I love Ecclesiastes. And I think that's why he says, at the end of the book, the conclusion of the matter is this: fear God and keep his commandments.
Hmm.
You know, under the sun, nothing, everything's vanity on its own. But when you fear God and you obey God, you anchor your life in that higher source of meaning. And that's really, what it's all about. And Ecclesiastes, is it Ecclesiastes? Help me remember where scripture says that there's eternity written in their hearts.
Hmm.
Is that, I
Yeah.
think, that phrase.
Hmm.
Um, and so, that reminds me of Lewis's argument from Desire. I'm not sure if
Hmm.
you're
Hmm.
familiar.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he says, we can see a connection between our innate desires, to get to your question about our innate desires, and then the world that God has made. In the medieval era, there was this idea that man was a microcosm of the cosmos, the macrocosm, in that there's a kind of fractal relationship between man and the cosmos, that basically the inside of man is a small mirror or equivalent of the whole world,
Hmm.
right? So Lewis is applying that idea to say, if I have the need to breathe air, it's because God has filled the world with air and oxygen. If I have a need or a desire, I thirst, it's because God has made water. If I hunger, it's because God has made bread and wheat and apples and food for me to eat. If I desire union or children, it's because God has made sex, a way for us to experience union and the reproduction of life. And so Lewis says, okay, logically, analogically, then, if I find in myself a desire for nothing that this world can satisfy, if I find in my heart a hunger, a thirst for eternity, it must mean that, like food, like sex, like water, eternity exists. That transcendent source of meaning exists. Um, and so I think that's Lewis's way of explaining how we can understand that our innate desires indicate a reality. We
Hmm.
long for God because God exists and that source of meaning really exists.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Oh no, that's great. I like that you brought his argument in there, the argument from Desire, because I've always liked that argument, but we don't use it a lot in apologetics because I think people just argue against it and there's no real way to bring like the scientific evidence for cosmological argument and stuff and the argument from design, but it's more just philosophical in general. And so people don't bring it up as much, but I think it has something to say. It brings a lot of depth to this topic of meaning the crisis of meaning and why we desire it so much. Because even in Marxism, like the naturalistic worldview, they create meaning because they said basically, yes, when you die, there's nothing. We're all just material, we're all just matter, but let's create our meaning, let's create purpose. And I've never seen so many hostile people who fight against Christianity itself, other than atheists. Who I was like, if we're all nothing and we're turning to nothing, why do you care so much? Like, why is this something that drives you to go jump on other people's comment sections and post and argue for nothing, basically? And so, when I was studying the Marxism for the worldview course that Frank and I are writing for the kids, there's like 10 commandments of Marxism. There's these things that they live by, the principles that they live by, because they're searching for a utopia on this side of the sun. And you can't, why? Because just like you said, that Lewis has argued for, there's an innate desire to reach something better, and they are working for it and with the exclusion of God, and they're not going to find it. So it's just really interesting how this topic of meaning is so important to just life itself, the things that we do when we wake up in the morning, how we look at our day and the day that we've been given. I couldn't imagine thinking of it without God. I couldn't imagine not being anchored in truth with this a simple thing like, I am a female. God made me a woman for a reason, and there's meaning to that. So it's very
Yeah.
interesting. I don't know that I've thought this much about meaning since you've been on my podcast. This is great.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that you bring up the different kinds of arguments. And I think that's connected. I'll see if I can kind of pull those strings together. Turning to Lewis, right, who's to me the model of wisdom in the modern world. So that you're right, like atheism and Marxism have this kind of religious structure,
Hmm.
right? Because if there's no God and everything's just molecules in motion, like why do you care so much,
Yeah.
right? Why are you proselytizing? Why are you and I think that's where this is another sign to me of this kind of crisis and turning point. And I do think the transgender issue is really kind of the is the linchpin the right metaphor, but this kind of pivotal issue because um okay, maybe according to the science, the rational materialist way of looking at it, this body has a female shape. But so what? Why do I care? Why do I have an obligation to the particular shape my body has? Why can't I make it mean anything I want it to mean, right? And this is, like Richard Dawkins is just this fascinating example where he's recently called himself a cultural Christian. I don't know if you've heard that.
I did.
He would have never said that like 10
Mm-mm.
years ago, 5 years ago, but it's because he's concerned about the moral crisis that is emerging from this, that's connected to the meaning crisis, right? And so what we're having, those rationalist types are having to grapple with is that in your atheistic rationalism, you've taken a few things for granted that you didn't want to realize, that you didn't want to look at, that kind of like the transgender crisis is forcing you to look at. That kind of why do you care, which is a value question, which is a meaning question, that the very endeavor of science actually depends upon value claims, that knowledge is valuable, that truth is valuable, that making up, that falsifying your experimental results is wrong. Those are all like value claims that have to do with meaning, that have to be assumed, believed by faith, before you can then conduct the whole endeavor of science or reason in the first place. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so that's why I think this is where Lewis is just a really helpful figure, because he was very rational. He was very rigorous in his logic, but he understood also this element of um, desire and value and meaning that reason itself is nested within, if
Mm.
that makes sense. Is
Mhm. Mhm.
that making sense?
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, I like that. That is, those are things that we should think about. I think our current cultural moment requires us to think about them. But whereas before, people in the past probably didn't have to. I mean, they weren't faced with a meaning crisis like we are now, and it presents an opportunity for us to bring meaning, to provide meaning, to speak the gospel message into a situation where people are looking for the truth. And I think that that's the biggest opportunity that we have. If people are noticing that this is not true, that it's not providing meaning, then they're going to look for the truth, and we have opportunity to present that. So that's why it's a good thing that we're noticing it and talking about it. And I don't know if you heard Jordan Peterson say this. My boys listen to him, my husband does. So he had said, when people don't feel like they're living for something, when there's no, we haven't, thank God, our kids haven't grown up where there's like World War I, World War II, where they're having to worry about drafts. And I pray to God that does not happen. But when they don't feel like there's meaning and purpose to life, they will look to slay the dragons. And Jordan Peterson's point was, there are no dragons. Dragons don't exist. So they kind of present a problem or invent an issue so that they can find meaning and purpose in it, because they want to slay that dragon. And so, first, I wanted to see if you had heard about that, or if you have even, or even if you haven't, what you think about it. And how do we restore meaning to the younger generations who are looking for something to live for?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's why Jordan Peterson is such a interesting, prominent figure right now, because
Mhm.
he really is responding to this meaning crisis
Yeah.
in really very interesting ways. You talk about the slain dragons, Jordan Peterson, as I understand him, one of his main theses is that life is first and foremost a story, and we need to understand it through stories, and that stories are one of the ways that we uh, perceive and understand the meaning of our lives, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, I agree with. I definitely agree with Jordan, and let me see if I can unpack that maybe a little bit for your audience. What does it mean that we understand the world through stories? Because that really is, as Jordan Peterson will point out, sometimes a postmodern claim, and so I think Christians get a little nervous about um, the idea that no, we understand the world through stories, and life is really a story because of its connection to some of the postmoderns. In fact, my husband and I, when we were dating, this is like one of our first arguments where he was like, postmodern's bad. And I was like, no, postmodernism has this one good point. And I think the way to kind of put that together is, okay, if modernism has failed, modernism is trying to understand the world through kind of facts, scientific facts, propositional claims. And what the postmodern people point out is those actually don't have a value structure, all these different claims. Um, and so the postmodern says you are creating a narrative by which to understand the world. And for the postmodern person, it's a narrative that you're making up. It's the way that we exert power over others by making up a narrative. And so what Jordan Peterson points out is that the postmoderns are right, that we do understand life through a story, but the story is not relative or subjective or to made up. There's kind of a universal story. And that's something I think Christians should not be afraid of, but really grasp and develop further, right? So the gospel is first and foremost a story. I mean, look at scripture from beginning to end. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. We have a beginning, and then we have a problem. This is your basic plot chart. Y'all remember
Yeah.
like taking
Yeah.
literature in high school and you have a little plot chart, right? And you start with exposition, which is your setting in your characters. And in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so we have our characters, Adam and Eve, and God in our setting creation. And then we encounter a problem or a conflict, right? Adam and Eve disobey, and that brings problems, and the problems get worse and worse and worse up to this climactic moment when a hero comes and he makes he sacrifices himself. He takes sacrificial action in order to restore the wrong and bring resolution to our world. That is the gospel. That is the cosmic story. And all of our doctrines that are really important, right? Jesus Christ is the Son of God. We are saved by faith. These are propositional doctrines. But what we have to realize is, if we want to understand the meaning, well, what does it mean that Jesus is God or that I'm saved by faith? I actually have to refer to the story. It's the story, the narrative, God's plan for the world from beginning to end that gives meaning to our propositional doctrines, as well as like our moral obligations and duties. I think what happened is, in modernism, we kind of tried to strip out the story, and Christians just have, the doctrines and the catechism and the duties, this is right and that's wrong. But when they aren't placed in the context of a story, they don't resonate. We don't really feel the meaning, and they don't rouse our desires, right, to fight dragons for God on our pilgrimage to heaven. It's in the context of story that those truths have meaning and get traction on our hearts. And so that's what I think Jordan Peterson's talking about. And I think he's really right. And even if, he's not a perfect man, and he Christians might have some things that they would want to correct, I think his main point is true, and something that we really have an opportunity to build on.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so too. And if it's resonating, how he communicates resonates for a reason. I mean, people are looking for, again, just like we've been saying, this is a meaning crisis. People feel it. They're looking for meaning. They're looking for somebody to attach meaning to the way that we live and the things that we're being confronted with in the culture. And that's why I think he's been so popular.
Yeah.
So what are your suggestions for us to live with meaning and purpose? Like, what do we need to start thinking about now, um, as we move forward from this episode and looking around? And I know that everyone knows about the transgender issue. They know about the abortion issues. We just got off an election season, and those things don't go away. Those were at the forefront of conversations. So we all know that there's a meaning crisis because of those issues. Maybe we didn't think about it before this episode. Maybe now we're putting things together where it's like, oh, that's deeper than just a political issue. So what do we do about that moving forward?
Yeah, this is a great question. And let, as a mom, a parent, and I know that probably a lot of your listeners are probably moms. Like, we think of our children and this next generation, and this world that they're living in, and this meaning crisis they're dealing with, and above all, I want my children to know that their lives and their bodies have meaning. And it's kind of odd to have to say bodies, but I look at like the transgender issue, the abortion issue, the hookup culture,
Mhm.
or where girls are treating their bodies like they're just a meat skeleton, a pleasure machine.
Yeah.
They're not treating their bodies as having values, right? So when I think about, how do we, for ourselves and especially for our children, right, help them see and experience the deep meaning of their lives and their bodies. So I think first and foremost, building on what Jordan Peterson is talking about, is to soak our lives in good stories,
Mhm.
right? And as I said, the gospel story is that kind of archetypal story. And so what that means is that every good story we tell is in some way a reflection or a participation in the gospel story. And so this is one reason why, the renewal of classical education, Charlotte Mason education, is so important, because when done properly, classical education is the story centered. You're reading the great books, you're reading the great stories that gave us this civilization. And as you read the great stories, the good stories, what you're seeing is the way that the cosmic gospel story plays out in 10,000 places, in, Rome, in medieval France, in the founding of America, in this person's life and that person's life. And the more that because remember, meaning is built up through relation, right? So the more different stories that I can relate to the gospel story and to my own, the story of my own life, the more meaning, the more layers of meaning the gospel is going to have for me. And then my own participation in that gospel will have. So one thing, read stories to your children, read fairy stories. The renewal of reading is so
Hmm.
important. Now, I know sometimes in some things, I started to figure it out when my kids were older, right? And it's harder to change habits when you've got teenagers. You're like, oh, you know what? I really slacked on reading to my children. And I can't get my 15-year-old to sit down and do story time with me right now. Like, hey, come curl up with mom. I'm going to read you a fairy story. Like, they'll just roll their eyes. It's not going to happen, right? So I also think, movies, they're great ways of telling stories. So have a family movie night and then talk about the movie. Um, watch watch shows together. Any way that you can bring stories into your life as a family, and then talk about that story and point out the connections between the gospel story, and then talk about the places where maybe this movie got it wrong and was kind of trying to deceive us about the true story. um, I think that's one really important thing that we can start to do to bring layers of meaning back into our lives, because we do become the stories that we tell. So I was
Hmm.
thinking about, you'll hear like an example of this. I was trying to think of an example, but it's kind of cliche, but someone who's telling themselves a negative story all the time. Oh, I'm just a loser. I can't do anything. Life's too hard. The world is oppressing me. Well, because we're creatures made in the image of God, that means we automatically imitate the things we hear and see. That's
Hmm.
just our nature, right? And so when we allow ourselves to hear bad stories, false stories, when we allow ourselves to tell ourselves negative stories, we automatically imitate and start living out those stories. And so, and I think parents all know this. So like, turn that movie off. I don't like what that movie's telling you, right? So
Right.
being faithful about cutting out bad stories.
Hmm.
That's not just enough. We have to fill our own imagination, our children's imagination, with great stories, stories that help them see in 100 different ways. You're a child of God, called to a life of great adventure, of slaying dragons and journeying, on your pilgrimage to heaven. The more that their imagination is filled with these stories of great adventure, the more they're going to see themselves in their own life as someone who's part of a great adventure, and they'll start imitating that and living that out. So that's like and that's isn't that fun? Like, I
Hmm.
think some of my best memories with my family were, we watch Lord of the Rings, the whole Lord of the Rings extended movie trilogy every Christmas. We watched, I'm not sure how your audience feels about Harry Potter. That could be a whole other topic, but we read and watched Harry Potter for years. And my daughter, on a walk last night, I was asking them, because I know I was going to talk to you today. I was like, how often do y'all think about like different stories and understand your own sort of life and experience through other stories? And both my daughters were like, all the time, like every day. I'm thinking about how, Harry Potter or Frodo or these different figures are showing me what it's like to live life as an adventure, what it's like to suffer for that which is good, what it's like to persevere, and how I can draw from that to like live better in my own life.
Hmm.
So stories, I think, are really important.
Yeah, I like that because I didn't expect you to go that route. I mean, I don't know what I really expected, but that's just such a great way to bring in one. It could be a family activity. Two, you can really see, like you said, attached this meaning to the stories. My sons and I, when I was teaching them the different worldviews, we would watch movies together, and then we would identify the worldview in the movies and pause the video, and we'd hear different things. and we'd say, okay, where is this worldview coming from and why did they believe that way? They got a little annoyed with it, and I'll still do it, even though they're a little bit older now. But I think they also appreciate it because it helped them see where the writer's coming from, the creator of the content, why they're even putting this storyline into the movie anyways. And my oldest loves to write stories. He loves it. He's always writing different stories. I don't know if one day he'll actually publish something, but the fact that he just loves to find that meaning. And I think it's so true when you do that activity as a family and you teach your kids that you don't have to buy into the narrative of the culture, that you can really show them this adventure through other experiences and books and movies. um, it helps them. It gives them a confidence too, and it helps them be able to attach the meaning without as they live without listening to the other voices. And it's with your parents helping monitor that and guide that. So that was
Mhm.
really, really good. I like that a lot because it's practical, you know?
Yeah. And
Yeah.
the worldview stuff is important. Um, but you're right, like you said, your son can get a little sick of that. And like we can overdo analysis on stories. And so it is, I think, important to be aware of that. Um, there's another way to connect to story is through paying attention to what attracts us in the story.
Mhm.
Um, so again, I do think the worldview analysis is important. I don't think we want to only have our conversations about story be in that analytical mode. And so another mode to offer in terms of how to connect to each other and to the meaning of the world through stories is to pay attention to your heart response to the story,
Mm.
to what you love, to what draws you into the story, and then to use that as an opportunity to understand yourself and your world better. For example, my daughter loves Star Wars. I never liked Star Wars, and I was like, oh, that's Buddhist stuff. And for my analytical worldview, I was like, oh, it's Buddhist, nonsense about detachment and there's the problem of dualism, blah, blah, blah. But my daughter loved it so much that I thought, you know what, I need to pause. So she finds something in that story meaningful. And I'm going to try to attend to what is attracting her heart. What is it that she is drawn toward? Because in the other, nothing is 100% false, right?
Yeah.
Nothing is
Yeah.
100% false. Everything has its thread of truth. And the way that we can draw ourselves and our children towards higher levels of truth or deeper levels of meaning is to start with where they're at. C.S. Lewis has this great line that I think is so wise. He says in Experiment on Criticism, which is a book about how to read, he says, you do not help someone develop better taste by criticizing the thing they love.
Mm.
Because, you know, so someone like, I'm trying to think of what would be maybe you see this a little bit with Marvel, okay? Because so many people love Marvel, but your really sophisticated storytellers are like, Marvel, it's not that great, right? Well, but there's something in it. It's not all bad. There's some truth, there's some good in these Marvel stories that have captured the imagination of millions and millions and millions of people. If there are better stories to tell, the way that we draw them towards better, more beautiful, more true things is by finding the thing they love in that story and then fanning the flame
Mm.
of that ember of taking the thing you love and the bit of truth they see and connecting it to the next step, to the next level of goodness, beauty, and truth.
Mm.
And so, and I found that helpful in terms of connecting to meaning through stories with children and with other people. Stories are such an apologetic opportunity, right? Because if you try and get someone to have a direct conversation about Christianity or, a lot of people just don't want to talk about it. They're just turned off, right? But if you can talk about, the latest movie that came out and why they liked it, and then start to I think of like laying crumbs so that their heart will move from this one tasty sweetness to the next one, to the next one, to the next one by connecting to that thing they loved in that story and then saying, oh, you know what? That's pointing towards this truth in the gospel, or this higher truth and reality. So in addition to the worldview stuff, paying attention to in stories, what is it in the story that we love, that our children love, that our neighbors love, and trying to help them connect the dots to God's story,
Yeah,
is a really powerful way to cultivate conversations and help them see those layers of meaning that God has given us.
that's great. I love that. I'll start doing that with my boys too, because that's just I think that's like the positive. And then you learn something about your kids. It's building a relationship and bonding. So I think that that's great advice. I want to start doing that. Hopefully other people will too. Annie, where can we find and follow you for more of all of the great things you have to offer?
Yeah, thanks, Shonda. My website, anniecrawford.net, has on the writing page, a list of essays and papers and articles that I've written, kind of unpacking. I have a whole essay on the power of story. Um, I have several essays, looking at specific movies, trying to help people see the layers of meaning in the story. Got an essay about Harry Potter. So people can go look there for some of that if they're interested. And then you can follow me on Twitter at Annie L. Crawford, or on Facebook, Annie Brown L. Crawford. And I'll always try and post things I'm doing there or things I'm thinking about, and inviting you into the conversation as we try to recover the meaning of our big, beautiful world and the great story that God has given us.
Well, thank you so much for coming on again. I really appreciate you sharing your time and your expertise. So it's always a good conversation with you.
Yeah, it's always fun to talk with you, Shonda. Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, you're welcome. All right, guys, for those of you that want to find Annie, and I suggest that you do if you haven't done so already, I'll link all of her information into the show notes. If you have any questions for her, you can also get in touch with her through her website, or if you can't for some reason, you can email me. I'll send it over to her. If you have any questions for me, you can email me at hello@shandafulbright.com, and I'll catch you on the next one.